In this episode of Church and Main, we look at how inclusive churches can do more harm to LGBTQ Christians than good at times. That's coming up. Hello and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. So it was about 10 years ago that the church where I serve, which is First Christian Church of St. Paul in St. Paul, Minnesota, became an open and affirming congregation. Now, what that means is that it is a congregation that openly welcomes LGBTQ people into the full life of the church. And that includes into leadership. That includes into being pastor, of which, as a out gay person, I am the lead pastor. Now, over the years, I've been thankful that people can come to this church and know that they'll be accepted and know that they won't be judged because of their sexuality. And as I said earlier, because I'm gay myself, there is a lot of good in having churches that can say that publicly. Now, saying all of that, can churches that are inclusive sometimes be detrimental to LGBTQ Christians and to that movement as a whole? About a month ago, I read an article on Substack and it had a very provocative title. With allies like these, who needs adversaries? And in that article, the writer shares their time at an inclusive congregation in Texas and how it at times failed to live up to being inclusive, not necessarily towards LGBTQ people, but in how they acted and basically even how they acted as Christians. Um, I found that article fascinating. And so I wanted to talk to the author, and that author is Ryan Self. He is a young gay Christian who lives in Austin, Texas. And so in this episode, I'm chatting with Ryan about his time at this congregation and how at times the drive to become inclusive may actually hurt the very people that these congregations seek to welcome. Now, I know up front that this is probably going to be a very provocative and it might be even a divisive episode for some. But I think that Ryan's voice is one that the movement, especially for wider inclusion of LGBTQ people in the life of the church, that we need to hear. It's important. So I hope that you'll please join me in this conversation with Ryan Self. So welcome to the podcast, Ryan. I wanted to start off by getting to know a little bit about you, your faith journey, and probably within the faith journey also kind of your coming out story. Um, so just to know a little bit more about who you are.
Sure, of course. I am thrilled to be on the podcast. It's actually my first podcast interview, so appreciate the opportunity. So I grew up in West Texas, Lubbock, Texas, be specific. So pretty conservative area. Grew up in the Churches of Christ. I'm not sure how familiar your listeners might be, but it's Protestant evangelical. It's maybe a distant cousin of Southern Baptist. There's some similarities there, obviously some differences as well, but overall
And
pretty
also, I was just going to say also cousins of I'm ordained in the Disciples of Christ. So
okay.
it's
Yeah.
we're basically in the same family, cousins.
Okay.
So.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. So conservative, Protestant, evangelical. Deep in the Bible Belt. My dad is an elder at the church. Growing up, we were there every Sunday night, every Wednesday night. Church was a big part of my growing up. Faith has always been important to me. It still is. After I left Lubbock, I went to Abilene Christian University, which is also a Church of Christ school. Lots of family members. My parents met at Church of Christ school. I have relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, just kind of what we did. So my, Church of Christ background, my conservative faith background, of course, very much a part of who I am.
Hmm.
Even though I'm not really a part of that world as much anymore. But it's still, the people and places and memories I have, deep affection for and still continue, to be part of things in some way. So after graduating, so actually, let me back up a bit. So while I was at, Christian college, Abilene Christian University, is when I really started to come to terms with my sexuality, being gay. I think at the time I probably would have described it as, same-sex attraction, more of a struggle, but unfortunately, part of my journey is also, I went to a form of conversion therapy, for about a year,
Hmm.
um, but I've been able to move past that, overcome that. That's part of my story, but not the whole thing. So yeah, now I live in Austin, Texas. Have for the past 2 years, and so past few years have been a part of, more affirming, or not more affirming, just straight up affirming churches, that also naturally leads itself to, just being around more progressive faith expressions. So I kind of live in this tension between a pretty conservative upbringing, and then now my family, or my family, my friends and those I'm around with are more on the progressive end. So I feel like I can kind of see both groups and appreciate what both bring to the table. But yeah, that's part of my faith journey. And so during that whole time, I've always been, church has been a big part of who I am, and a part I want to a big part of my life. And faith in Jesus and Christianity has been, throughout that whole time. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I was interested in interviewing you is because I think our journeys are somewhat similar. I came from, I would say, Black church slash evangelical background. Um, and also, I think I came out in my mid 20s.
Yeah.
And so it's always been for me a tension, especially because I'm in more progressive circles now, between kind of honoring. I'm not someone that just kind of discounts my past.
Sure.
I feel like that past still has something that has shaped who I am. And and so it's always been a tension between that, the past were my past and then my present, and also how some people view the past.
Mhm.
And that's actually what we will get at in this article. And you wrote an article for Baptist Press that was originally on your Substack that's called "With Allies Like These, Who Needs Adversaries?" And the allies is in quotes. Um, and so that is probably my first question, because the whole point of the of allies is usually that there's someone that is working with you, helping you, being along the journey. And a lot of your article is kind of dealing with what you felt in a church that you were a part of.
Mhm.
So what led you to think the allies were kind of not really allies?
Sure. So I wrote this Substack piece, that it seems like it's gotten some good attention, and so most recently with the Baptist News Global, that went up this morning. But yeah, there were for about 2 years I was the first affirming church that I was a part of here in Austin. Um, I was very involved. I was there every Sunday, most Sundays that I could be there. I was part of the children's ministry. I mean, I was invested in this church, and uh you know I very quickly felt like something was just a bit off. I'm just part of the things that I share in this article, the fact that last summer they threw a drag show
Hmm.
at the church, in the church building, marketed as Drag Me to Church, drag extravaganza, biblical proportions. It feels intentionally provocative, like we're trying to inject the culture wars into the church, because they don't necessarily feel helpful. You have board members sharing pretty incendiary social media posts. I mean, not just kind of your typical stuff, stuff like in the hours after the first Trump assassination attempt, saying things like political violence is the most American of all values. Uh, pretty intense stuff. And so I shared about some of those experiences and how they can be deeply alienating, not just alienating to conservatives and moderates, but also just alienating to liberals and progressives. People left this church over the drag show. And, this is a pretty progressive church. It's a church that um, markets itself as inclusive and affirming and LGBTQ friendly at every opportunity. And so, the people that are leaving, they're not leaving because they oppose inclusion. They're leaving because it seems like that a form of ideological activism has taken the place of Jesus. And I don't say that lightly, but recently the pastor, another part of my piece is the pastor posted on Facebook, "Don't trust in Christianity." That's a video that's on the church's Facebook page where the pastor is just kind of flippantly saying, "I don't trust Christianity much," which is pretty stunning to hear, from any pastor, but also, the damage that does to a church that basically has a rainbow pride flag as part of its logo that is broadcasting to the world, hey, we're affirming, we're progressive, we are LGBTQ friendly, and at the same time saying, don't trust in Christianity. Well, that just plays into the idea that you can't be both gay and Christian, that you have to give one of these things up. That in order to become affirming and to embrace LGBTQ people, you have to step away from Christianity. And that is just such a toxic message. That is the opposite of what I think a lot of people would hope to send out into the world. And so not only do I share some experiences with that are, I think, they're just driving people away from the cause of LGBTQ inclusion and support for same-sex marriage, but also I wanted to share some examples of groups I think are doing it right. Things
Mm-hmm.
Groups that are groups like the Reformation Project with Matthew Vines, who is trying to equip gay and LGBTQ Christians to engage, to make arguments based on scripture, to root their faith journey in scripture that they can share that with others. Not just shouting people down, not just being in arguments online, not just shutting people out of your life, but really trying to engage with people where they are. Groups like Centerpiece, which is led by so two dear friends, Karen King and Sally Gary. I've known Sally Gary for years. I first got to know her at ACU. Just the model of grace and patience and understanding and meeting people where they are. Um, I'm not trying to needlessly offend or alienate people, but trying to beckon as many people as they can. The church I'm at now is called Restore Austin. It's led by Zach Lambert. And that's another example of, a church that I think is, again, just doing it right. They chose not. They're approached about the drag show, and they said, no, we're not gonna. We don't think that's really a good choice for us, for a
Mm-hmm.
number of reasons. And it just, that kind of different approach is just evident in all facets of the church. And one thing that I note is you have Restore Austin, then you have the church that's hosting drag shows, and you can just see the numbers. The church that's hosting drag shows, they've been losing members. They've been having financial struggles. they've got people that are leaving, people that are still invested, but they're leaving because they're saying, hey, this is just not what we want.
Hmm.
Doesn't feel like it's really rooted in Jesus or Christianity or scripture or anything. It feels like it's just rooted in activism. And people are leaving that church and they're coming over to Restore Austin or other places. And so this is the same zip code. So you kind
Hmm.
of have this example of, you know, uh, what do LGBTQ Christians actually want? Well, they want the real thing. They want the scripture. They want the church that is, about scripture in the Bible and the faith practices that have been around for centuries. So yeah, that's just kind of a general overview, and we can take it any direction you want.
Yeah, yeah. One of the first things I wanted to ask, kind of I guess maybe playing devil's advocate here, is, with the drag show, people would say maybe, we see things like drag queen story hour, things like that. Um, so I guess maybe the question would be, what's so wrong about having a drag show in church? And I mean, what would your answer be to that?
Sure, there's the marketing of the drag show. There's the drag me to church, drag extravaganza, biblical proportions. Whenever you're talking about LGBTQ and affirmation, there's a group that's going to be offended no matter what. It's going to be provocative to some group of people no matter what. Okay.
Hmm.
So, of course, you can't just make that the sole reason of your decision. But I think when we talk about needlessly provoking people, that's a concern of mine. And also the fact that, rightly or wrongly, here in Texas, if you have a drag show, you have to uh, label it as 18 plus. It's adults only. And that's the law. Like it or not, that's just the reality on the ground. So if you're marketing a drag show at a church, you are marketing an adults only event in the sanctuary. And that's just going
And
to come across. But go ahead.
I would just want to say, and to clarify there, it has to be labeled 18 plus because that's Texas law.
That is Texas law. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So that's like it or not, love it or hate it, it is what it is. And so when you're posting on social media about, you know, these words and phrases that are going to come across to people as just provocative, like we're out there to thumb our noses at, conservatives or moderates. We're taking culture war issues and we're injecting them into the church. That's just uh, you can see the people left, families left. And again, we're talking about LGBTQ inclusion, affirming churches, they come to decisions that, families may leave over the decision to become affirming. That's just the nature of it. Any church is going to lose people no matter what. But when it comes to something where it's like, what did we gain out of that? You know, one of the pushbacks that I've received is, well, the when at the end of the show, people were near tears. People were very emotional about it. And I can appreciate that to a degree, but I don't is that how we make decisions? Is that how we discern what a good course of action is like what emotion it stirs up? Are
Hmm.
we doing that instead of, what is, the way of Jesus telling us what is the best for the church? How do we see, are we helping or hurting the cause of inclusion? Are we doing things that are needlessly alienating? I think another thing I would mention is, being a part of these other groups like Centerpiece and whatever. Um, you know, at the conference last year, I got to meet some folks from West Texas, from Amarillo, and they're at a more conservative church. There's a gay couple there that's part of a conservative church, non-affirming, but they worked with the eldership, with the leadership, to create a space for gay Christians, um, just as a support group, just as a place to belong. It's not affirming. They worked very close with they built relationships with that church. They wanted, but it's that's they were able to build a place where gay Christians in this very conservative area are able to come. Now, drag shows in Austin, Texas. That's great that, some drag performers are able to find yet another progressive audience to perform in front of. But what about the gay people in Amarillo? What about the gay
Hmm.
people in the rural areas? What about the gay people in those conservative churches where they may not even have a place to belong? And the people they're around are seeing, you know, drag shows at church, and it's just setting off alarm bells. So I wish that sometimes with these decisions, we were thinking like, how will this impact those in the rural areas? How will this impact, Christians, gay Christians in conservative and red areas? So I guess that's how I would respond to that question.
And you talked about that in your article of how sometimes people will make fun of those conservative areas. And you talked about an experience of your parents visiting, coming from Lubbock, um, obviously coming from a more conservative, probably not just a conservative area, but more conservative church. Could you kind of expound a little bit about that and what that meant to you? And this
Yeah,
was at your prior churches.
yes. So this is at the prior church, the drag show church. Um, yeah, so like again, I'm from Lubbock. I'm from a conservative area. My dad is an elder there. For about 2 years, I was at this church, and every time that I would mention I was from Lubbock, the response is, "Ugh, I'm sure you were glad to get out of there." Just that condescending, sneering attitude. Just this like assumption that everyone from that area is irredeemable is how it came across to me.
Hmm.
That why? Oh, you obviously ran away from there because, ugh, and this will be the first time I would meet them. This isn't like some friend I've known for a long time. This is, the ministry staff. This is the pastor. This is just so many interactions like that. And of course, it's off-putting to me. I don't love that. And is that welcoming? I would say no. Um, and it's Sunday mornings you normally hear there's a joke about Trump or about Ron DeSantis, or they're talking about people from red states, not just you know denouncing a policy or a program that seems antithetical to Christianity or the life of Jesus, but just mocking people. One time I remember we had a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, come, and he was kind of sharing about that faith practice, and they put up on the screen a picture of the one of the pastors put up on the screen a picture of the yarmulke. I'm like, what does this symbolize? What does this mean? And the next slide they showed was a red yarmulke with "Make America Great Again" on it, and as a joke was saying, and then what do you think this means? You know, as a joke, but it was an uncomfortable moment to me at least. And it
Hmm.
was just like, so now it's not just that we're denouncing Trump's policies, now we're just mocking Trump supporters. And so there was just that attitude just throughout the church. And, my parents come, they're from Lubbock. My dad's an elder at a conservative church. And when they would come and they would visit and they would come to this church. I mean, I think hats off to them. They definitely didn't agree with everything that was being preached that Sunday, but they were there. And I would just always be nervous about, what are they hearing? What, please don't mock conservatives today. Please don't mock those who are religiously or politically, on the right. But yeah, it's that kind of thing where again, this place was alienating to conservatives and moderates. And the thing is, like it or not, support for same-sex marriage, support for LGBTQ people, it's going to require support from conservatives. So that the whole time we're just alienating and dividing and thumbing our noses at them and being provocative, that's not helping the cause of same-sex marriage or the cause of LGBTQ inclusion.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was another example of ways that like this church is just it's alienating.
So one of the things that you talked about earlier is that you heard this actually from the pastor about not trusting Christianity,
Mhm.
and that's something I've heard from other pastors as well. And I guess my question about that is, why do you think that is? Why do you think people want to just kind of reject the entire faith? Um, when I mean, part of the whole point of trying to be an inclusive church is to show that there is another way, that there is, it doesn't have to be all exclusive or rejectionist, but it almost seems that they're kind of practicing what they are saying that they're against.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know they have a good answer. I think if this pastor I've heard him say some things that are similar. I think he and others would say, well, I love Jesus, the character of Jesus. I'm not a fan of the rest of this stuff, which to me it feels like, well, yeah, it's kind of a package deal. It's the Gospels are obviously central, but
Hmm.
there's other books, you know, just picking and choosing is obviously not part of Christianity. But you know, I don't know why. I think there's a disdain, more than disdain. There's a contempt for Paul just because of the ways that Paul has been interpreted in speaking about, those verses have been used to argue against LGBTQ inclusion or women in the church or what have you. And so there's just kind of, instead of really engaging with what scriptures say and coming to a new understanding, it's like, we're just going to throw the whole thing out. We're just going to throw Paul out. We're going to throw the rest of the stuff out. There's, problematic stuff in the Bible in the Old Testament. We're done with that. And there's just kind of a throw the baby out with the bathwater attitude, it feels like. So there's just kind of this, oh well, we're done with Christianity. We like Jesus and like what he said, but we're just done with the rest. Is my take on it, I guess.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's funny because I just interviewed a pastor um, from the Dallas Fort Worth area,
Mm,
and he kind of also came from an evangelical background and got involved in the emergent church kind of about
mm,
decade and a half ago. And one of the things he talked about there is about how one of the problems with that movement at times and why it ended up in some ways failing is that it really ended up basically deconstructing itself out of the church.
yeah,
That everything was wrong, and so that at the end you just didn't have the church. And this sounds, what you're explaining sounds very familiar. It's almost as if there's a kind of a deconstructing going on that then ends up just kind of chucking out the baby with the bathwater.
yeah, yeah. And I would add on to that by just saying, the LGBTQ Christians that I know, they've stuck with it despite everything that's they've been done to them or that's happened. A few weeks ago, I was at a retreat as part of Centerpiece. I would definitely encourage your listeners to check out centerpiece.org. It's a great organization. They have a conference every year. They also have retreats throughout the year. I was able to go to one of them. There's about 25 LGBT Christians from all over the country, and just the stories. And you have people that have been kicked out of their churches. Some have been kicked out of their families. Uh, just heartbreaking stories, but yet they're still firmly committed to their faith. They're still firmly committed to Christianity. It is a huge part of their lives. It is the central thing. And so when you talk about, don't trust in Christianity, it's such an affront to the faith of LGBT Christians that have remained steadfast despite everything that's happened.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's a real disservice to them. And so I want to read part of the article uh, for Baptist News Global. I was able to get a few quotes from Matthew Bynes
Hmm.
just about this phenomenon, and I think he's got some really solid insights. He's talking about the phenomenon of these churches in general. But when he says, when a church becomes affirming but then proceeds to discard core Christian doctrines like the bodily resurrection or the divinity of Jesus, it does more harm than good to LGBTQ Christians. It also ironically reinforces the message of the non affirming church that you cannot be gay and Christian. For
Hmm.
non affirming churches, the problem is being gay, but when affirming churches abandon any commitment to Christian orthodoxy, they are effectively telling gay people that they cannot still be a Christian. It is the same spiritually deadening message in reverse. And most LGBT Christians I know would rather attend a non affirming church that remains committed to Scripture rather than an affirming church that doesn't. What matters most for LGBT Christians isn't simply whether a church becomes affirming, it's whether a church becomes affirming while remaining clearly and unapologetically Christian. I think that hits the nail on the head. And for me, anecdotally, I would say, yeah, I would rather go to a non-affirming church that is still deeply rooted in scripture than an affirming church like the one I was at, that we've just abandoned Christianity and it's now ideological activism all the way down.
Hmm. There's a pastor that I know in Memphis that is a pastor's a Disciples of Christ congregation um, that isn't officially affirming, but in its practice, it pretty much is. And he has said he regularly receives a number of LGBTQ people that come, especially from other affirming churches. And when he asked, what made you decide to come here, it's kind of like, well, you guys talk about Jesus here. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's always been fascinating to hear that it's like, okay, that's a problem. If, we're creating an affirming church, but we're not going to talk about about Jesus at all. I mean, I think there is some truth to what Matthew is saying, that it kind of basically affirms the argument that non-affirming people have long said, that you can't be gay and Christian.
Yeah, it's devastating.
Do you think that there is this desire in some cases, in some LGBTQ churches, um, but other places where it's more of a putting everything into activism or maybe ideology than it is in the faith? But that the faith is kind of seems like it just comes up short. So we're just going to put it into this because this is really what works
Hmm.
and what what makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that in some place. I mean, there's a classic faith versus works, and it is very, you see some of these places, and they are, involved in their communities. They are,
Hmm.
doing a lot of good work. I'm not saying that at all. There's lots of good stuff happening as far as attending to the needs of the community. I guess I just feel like that's great. If you want to do that and without the faith stuff, we'll just become a nonprofit. Just become, LGBTQ friendly nonprofit and do that work. But if you want to be a church and market yourself as a church, well, you got to be a church. And that means Christianity and scripture and all that stuff is still very much a part of that. Because yeah, it does feel like, well, we have these values about the poor and the marginalized. Um, but just yeah, there's that deconstruction has happened to where that's just no longer part of it. But it's like the works of the church are still appealing, and so you get the situation where yeah, it's kind of like a nonprofit without the meat, the
Hmm.
Christianity.
And you talked a little bit, I can't remember if you talked about it here or on in your Substack. There was another article that you wrote about a church in Pennsylvania. I think it was in Philadelphia. Um, the author had wrote a book about this church, and the church that was very much geared towards social justice, but how it kind of
Hmm.
went off the rails. Um, and I'm kind of curious, where do you kind of see the similarities between your experience at your church, your prior church in Austin, and this other church that you talk about in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I so the book is called Circle of Hope. Um,
Yes.
Circle of Hope, I would definitely recommend it to anyone who is interested in this phenomenon, um, because the the author Eliza Griswold, she's a journalist who basically was embedded with this church for years, and she got lots of access to the pastors and the members, and it is a deep dive, and it is fascinating. But what happened? You see this slow decline of this once thriving church, where it's a kind of a collection of activists, really,
Hmm.
that start to drive the church in a certain direction. And once it starts heading that way, it's kind of like there's not much to stop the momentum. Part of
Hmm.
it's COVID. COVID's a part of the story. It's just a natural detangling. That's obviously going to impact the church. But when it comes to, you know, active, not being able to separate the difference between activism and Christianity. And obviously those two can play a role together.
Hmm.
Activism and protest and the civil rights movement and social justice parts of those can be all together. But it becomes this situation where you have um, a collection of voices are really the ones that get to be heard. And I
Hmm.
think a big one of the parallels that I saw is you have the most vocal, the most progressive voices are getting to dictate how the church is leading. And I felt like I saw that at this church, and then it becomes a silencing of dissenting voices.
Hmm.
And once you start you silencing dissent, then it becomes this spiral where people that aren't on board with what's going on are kind of leaving out the back door. And so more and more, the only people that are left are this very ideologically driven, less rooted in Christianity, and just becomes that cycle. And so, what I saw at this church that I was a part of, um, you know, ironically enough, I wrote a review of Circle of Hope. And in it, because I saw these similarities, I talked about, briefly, just an unnamed church that I felt like had replaced, Christianity with ideological activism. And, the response from that, I got a lengthy text message from a board member within hours, 200 plus word accusatory, critical message. The next day, I got another message from a previous board member who, at one point, he's gay, but said maybe you should consider your feelings toward gay Christians. Basically,
Hmm.
and to me, felt like he's accusing me of internalized homophobia and this, just intense backlash because I'm a gay Christian saying on my Substack, an unnamed church, hey, I think they're drifting away from Christianity. And the reaction is telling, you know? And they were kind of just proving my point that like, yeah, like dissent is just not allowed. If you're raising alarm about this, it's just not allowed. So there's not, a chorus of voices who are able to discern, what the best course of action is, how some voices maybe more conservative, maybe more progressive, maybe more moderate, are all joined together. Let's figure this out together. It's just who is the loudest voice in the room is now dictating what the course of actions, and that just becomes a spiral. And I feel like I saw that at the church I was a part of, and that was a major part of the Circle of Hope as well.
Hmm. What do you think about, I mean, because, your talk about this church, and one of the things I always find interesting is to hear that sometimes I guess even I get a little weary or wary more of the word inclusive. Um, because maybe to quote the Princess Bride, it's kind of I don't think you know what that word means. Because I think we use it a lot, but I don't know if we always know, really try to live it out. And maybe that there's a challenge in how we live that out. And I think that you kind of talk about that in the article that, and one of the things I thought was interesting is that you have a quote here from Zach Lambert, that I thought was interesting. And he says, Jesus didn't just trade one exclusionary stance for another. This is what we often do. When we feel excluded, we have a
Right.
tendency to exclude the excluders right back. Jesus created the first truly inclusive table of all, where prostitutes and tax collectors sat next to priests and teachers of the law, a place where everyone is called to set aside their biases, take up their cross, and follow him. And I think what's interesting about that is that I sometimes wonder if we really could handle true inclusion.
Mhm.
Um, because I think sometimes we don't really know what it means.
Yeah.
That's just something
Well,
I've observed.
yeah, I definitely feel that way. I remember when Zach taught that sermon, I posted on my just a note on Substack, and I started with saying inclusion is one of those words that yeah, I start to get my eyes rolling.
Hmm.
Inclusion is one of those words I don't know what it means. When people say that word, I don't know what it means. Um, a lot of time it feels like it's just a synonym for progressive. You know, we
Hmm.
are well, we're an inclusive church. We're a progressive church. We're not interested in conservatives or moderates. We're not. If you're not on board with some of those things, you know, uh, the this particular church, they have on their website, they talk about belonging over belief, and that
Hmm.
you know belonging comes first, and as we belong, then beliefs will follow. Beliefs are kind of secondary, which there's all kind of issues I have with that, just you know just in and of itself. But it's all about belonging, and so they're saying like certain Christian beliefs are secondary. Belonging is what's most important. But in my experience, when I think about it, it's like, yeah, but there you may be able to believe all kinds of things. You may not even have to believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Do certain church leaders believe in, some of those doctrinal statements? Unclear. You know where they stand on drag shows. You know where they stand on certain progressive, ideologies. What's the latest thing, queers for Palestine, things like that. Like you know where they stand. And so
Hmm.
it's like, oh no, it may not be Christian beliefs that we all have to ascribe to, but like, oh, there are beliefs that like you better not question these particular beliefs. And if you question them, belonging, it's gonna be tough.
Mm-hmm.
you may not belong anymore. And so it's
Mm.
really it's the irony of that. I mean, in my experience, I was part of this dinner group that met once a month that was hosted by one of the board members at this church. And it's a place for LGBTQ Christians, and it was a wonderful environment. We joined together in a meal every month, but I would have interactions with some folks from the church who were board members themselves that I felt were very hostile. One, I posted a New York Times op-ed that he didn't agree with, and I got several heated messages. And when I pushed back and said, I wish you were more thoughtful how you came across online, well, I got several more heated messages. At one point saying, this policing my social media is reminiscent of a evangelical culture I left behind, you know, and
Which is funny because it sounds like this person was also policing social
absolutely,
media.
it's a bizarre alternate world where you can post things like um, political violence is the most American of all values, and someone shares an op-ed, a New York Times op-ed you don't like, oh, they're coming for you, and if you push back, well, you're engaging in evangelical culture. It's bizarre. Um, but yeah, it's like, is that inclusive? Is that welcoming? This is a board member at that church, you know? Um, when I get that lengthy text message from the host, who is also a board member, instead of let's, hey, let's grab coffee. It sounds like you have some frustrations with this church. I want to hear about them. It's no, you're wrong and misleading. You are this and that and the other. Um, there's no curiosity about why you feel that way. This is a straight person telling a gay person. Uh, there was nothing inappropriate or offensive about the drag show, and we would be happy to do it again. It's like, well, I don't. Where is this conversation supposed to go from there? Um, is that inclusive? Is that welcoming? Is that no, of course not. So it's like, yeah, I learned pretty quickly which beliefs you don't question.
Mm.
You can believe any number of things about Jesus, God, whatever, the Bible. You may not believe anything at all. And that's totally fine because beliefs are secondary. What's most important is belonging. But just don't question the progressive beliefs. That's where you're
Mm.
gonna get in trouble. And that's just another example to me of how, you know, uh, yeah, it seems like we've replaced Christianity and Jesus with this ideological activism that is just a whole separate thing.
Yeah, and like I said, I think looking at that quote, I think that inclusion is always going to be, in some ways, messy, because it's going to include. It means in trying to include people that you may not always agree with,
Right.
and that you're trying to find, and especially within the church, of how do you keep yourself together in the body. And now it doesn't mean intolerating abuse, but it does mean how do we keep people and see people as fellow people together in Christ. And like you, I think I'm always a little wary now when I hear the word inclusive, because I don't know what you're really talking about. Because I think if we really want to be that, and I think we should, it's not going to be easy, and because it never is, um, and that maybe that type of inclusion only really happens, and especially looking at Zach's quote, really can only happen through Christ, because we do a bad job of it all on our own, just in seeing how sometimes it's lived out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's 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 hard. I mean that like it's not just love your neighbor, it's also love your enemy. And that's
Mm-hmm.
hard.
Yeah.
And that means if you're more of the progressive end, you got to love the conservative. And if you're on the
Mm-hmm.
conservative end, you have to love the progressive.
Mm-hmm.
You have to make space for those people in your church. You can't just say, well, obviously we're all good, fill in the blank, and those people over there, uh, well, we don't want to deal with them. Like, no, that's not how that works.
One of the things I want to do before as we wrap up is I was actually curious if you read the article in the New York Times by Andrew Sullivan about um, the gay rights movement,
Yeah.
where it's going, some troubling signs that he's seen, and what you thought about it. Sullivan, just to kind of backfill there, has been someone I've always kind of been interested in following. I think he was someone that was central in helping me to come out. That's coming from a more, I would say, slightly conservative background. Seeing someone similar and a similar person of faith. Um, and he wrote that article. I think it seems like he got some good responses from it. But I'm kind of curious what you thought about it, and what do you think it means kind of for the LGBTQ movement, especially within the church?
Yeah, I definitely read that article and really enjoyed it. I'm a big fan of Andrew Sullivan. I read his Substack each week.
Mm-hmm.
I was pleasantly surprised that they published it, but it's a good read. I would encourage anyone. It's a long read. It is just kind of unpacks where things might have gone wrong, but yeah, it is kind of a lot of the same themes of, you know, I I was fairly young when Andrew Sullivan was doing his, we can call it activism work.
Mm-hmm.
But Andrew Sullivan, he wrote, I believe, a book arguing both sides, a book of
Mm-hmm.
like, here are the best arguments for gay marriage, here are the best arguments against it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a very different mindset from just shutting people down. If you don't agree, we're going to shut you down, we're going to ostracize you. Um, it is that listening and engaging with people on the other side. It is to Andrew Sullivan's telling, the gay rights movement for or a good chunk of time leading up to Obergefell, obviously there's always, you got radicals in every group, but for the most part, it's a lot of, hey, we're just people too. We're like
Mm-hmm.
we want what you have. We're gonna align under the banner of like we're all Americans, we're all Christian, um, you know, to use that word inclusive, we're all included in this. We want to be included in this tradition called marriage. You know, don't want to radically overhaul the institution. We want to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about you know, yeah, trying to persuade people. And then somewhere along the way, as LGBTQIA2SL plus just kept growing, it became about something else and it wasn't about persuading people. It was about you're either with us or against us.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
part of it is I'm trying to think of how we phrase it, but just kind of this industrial complex of the groups,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you saw a few months ago, it was like Glad. There was a story about Glad, how their CEO was kind of under fire because it was just lavish expense
Mm-hmm.
accounts.
Yep.
She remodeled her kitchen and she's got this and that and the other. She's got a house in the Hamptons and whatnot, and because the messaging was just like this is another topic just to talk about is the way that this was kind of how Andrew Sullivan began. The way that the groups began talking about this wasn't about integration. It's now like, if you are LGBTQ, you are oppressed and you are under threat, and this is the worst time ever, and it's unprecedented, and like we got donate now, you know, and became about fundraising appeals.
Mm-hmm.
Once gay marriage is achieved, that's a pretty big milestone, you know. And there's been a few other legal wins, in the past several years, but legally there's a lot of, they could kind of hang up their hats if you're talking about just, support for gay marriage and stuff like that. But these groups have been established, and they have to do something. So now it's about fundraising appeals of, and try persuading, it's going to the base, telling the base, donate now because things are so bad, they're oppressive, your rights are under attack. And it just kind of became this whole complex of, you know, mobilizing the base instead of trying to persuade those on the other side of the issue. And you can see it where, the past few years, the support for same-sex marriage it's starting to dip.
Yep.
And that's part of why I wrote this Substack post was I'm seeing that, I'm nervous, and I'm saying some of y'all are not helping,
No.
some of you allies are not helping. So that's part of what led me to write the Substack post. But yeah, I will say, you know, I wrote my post. It was like a week or so later. Matthew Vines wrote a very similar post, which I would definitely recommend anyone to read that one. Very similar things. And then about a week later, Andrew Sullivan, wrote his New York Times. So I feels like there's a conversation happening about, some in the LGBT community are saying like, hey, there's some of y'all that are just not being helpful. So yeah,
Yeah,
counterproductive.
exactly. Well, if people want to know more about you or kind of follow you, probably read the article on the Substack, where should they go?
Yeah, so my Substack is called Ryan's Boring Book Club. I usually, review books and then occasionally I write this other stuff. It's ryanclarkself.substack.com. But yeah, I feel free to like and share and follow. And I just, again, just want to plug the other groups that I mentioned, Centerpiece, Restore Austin, Reformation Project. These are all good groups that are, I think, we can model after.
All right. Well, Ryan, I think at some point I would like to have you back because were
I'd love
tons of
to.
other of subjects that I wanted to
Oh, of
talk about
course.
that we didn't have a chance to. But thank you for this, and we will again talk soon.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you so
All
much.
right. So I want to thank Ryan for taking the time to chat with me on this episode. I'm curious to know what people's opinions were. Um, you can feel free to send me an email to churchandmain, that's all one word, at substack.com. I'm also going to include a few links, a link to the article that Ryan talks about in question. And then I'm also will include a link to, he talked a little bit about Matthew Vines, who is um, an evangelical Christian who is openly gay, and a link to his organization. And then finally, I thought I would include a link to um, an op-ed. It's a rather long one, but I think a good one, an op-ed in the New York Times by Andrew Sullivan. For those who are unaware, Andrew Sullivan is an gay Catholic writer, actually someone that I think has been important to me, especially in my own coming out journey. He talks about kind of the progress that was made, especially when it came to same-sex marriage, but also some of the ways that the LGBTQ movement has um, basically sometimes overreached, and that has been detrimental to the movement as a whole. Again, all of these articles are going to be things that people may not always agree with. But I think it's important to hear this view. Um, it is actually a view that I tend to maintain, and that does not mean that I don't have no interest in LGBTQ equality, and it's very much important. And in my thing. I think this morning I was actually reading an article about someone that I follow on Substack that's very conservative, who just wrote an article that was just incredibly demeaning towards LGBTQ Christians, basically saying that they weren't Christians. Um, Obviously, that is not what these articles are saying. Um, but what I mean is that there is still things to be done, movement that we need to work on. And I think the question is, how do we do that? And how do we move? And how do we um, move forward? Um, so I do hope that you will read those articles um, and think about them. And it's free. It's okay if you don't agree. Um, I think that's also important too. But I do think it's important to have this viewpoint, and I'm glad that Ryan was able to come and share his views. So, if you do want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, as I always say, visit churchandmain.org. You can also go to churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. And I hope that you will do that. There are some just musings that I come up with, especially in the time that we're in, that you can read those on Substack. I hope that you will, if you will consider subscribing to the podcast, and even more important, I hope that you will consider leaving a review or a rating. When you do that, that helps others find this podcast. I also include in the show descriptions links to where you can make a donation, especially through Buy Me a Coffee, and also to join our email list. I don't promote as much as I used to on social media, partially because I've seen the research that's usually social media is not the number one way anymore that people discover new things. So if you would like to get this in your inbox when any new episode comes live, the best way to do that is to join the email list. So please feel free to use the link that is in the show description to get on the list. So that is it for this episode of Church and Main. I hope that you will also consider sharing this podcast with family and friends. As I always like to say, thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.